Hey team, so today I am going to be trying something new and I'm going to be presenting on a topic. So today's topic is going to be understanding adaptation from theory to application. What we're going to cover is the human body as an adaptive organism, models of adaptation, understanding training load, and then putting it all together in practice. So, adapt or die. Organisms are reactive in nature. They respond to pressures from their environment in order to survive. When we think about how organisms adapt over time, typically we think about evolution. So we think about the long-term adaptations across generations. In this particular mode of adaptation, basically some kind of random mutation takes place at a genetic level. If that random mutation gives a preferential advantage to the individual within that species that expresses that phenotype, then it's more likely that individual is going to be able to procreate. That then means that that particular gene is going to end up expressed to a higher degree within the next round of the gene pool. And that phenotype is going to be expressed to a greater extent in generations moving forwards. When it comes to training, we kind of need to think a little bit more about epigenetics, which is the short-term adaptations that take place within an individual as they're exposed to stressors from their environment. Those stressors can upregulate the expression of certain genes, which are associated with particular proteins, enzymes, and hormones that will help them to cope better with the demands that are being placed upon them. So those adaptations are specific in their outcomes. Okay, so we're being stressed by our environment. We then adapt to that environment by upregulating the production of certain things. And as a result, we can cope better and we can perform better moving forwards. We have broken this system slightly in that before we used to respond to pressures from our environment. That environment was ever changing and kept on presenting risks that we had to adapt to. But now we've reached a point as a species where we kind of control our environment. So we don't really get exposed to those pressures in the same way anymore. And actually, we kind of have to manipulate our environment in order to realistically feel some level of threat. So training is a way that we can do that. We can manipulate our environment to expose ourselves to certain pressures and as a result force our bodies to adapt in a desirable way to improve our performance. So I've called this projecting fitness, but what we're really looking at is models of adaptation. The first one that always comes up whenever you listen to anyone talk about how the human body adapts is the general adaptation syndrome. It's when you listen to people from the world of fitness kind of talk about it, they talk about it as though it's entirely related to fitness. But the truth is that it's just a global understanding of how the human body responds to stress. So stage one, we experience alarm. We're pushed out of homeostasis. The body's pushed out of balance in some way. And then as a result of that, we move into phase two where we start to resist it. We start to create some form of adaptation and start to see maybe a slight improvement in performance within that phase. But if that stress is in place for an extended period of time or at too great a magnitude, then we'll hit this exhaustion phase, stage three, where we start to see a drop-off in performance. And that can link quite nicely to the idea of what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. And it's kind of the fundamental premise behind the dose-response relationship, in that the dose-response relationship is hormetic in nature, meaning that we kind of have to expose ourselves to enough of a stimulus in order to meet a threshold for adaptation. Any increase beyond that point in the size or magnitude of the dose that we're exposed to will lead to an increase in the degree to which we adapt. But as we increase that dose further, we might see that the stimulus becomes too great. It starts to overwhelm us a little bit and we start to fail to adapt, but potentially even worse than that, we start to see a drop-off in performance and we start to begin to become overwhelmed and we see that performance potentially even drop below the levels prior to that stimulus being in force. So the next model is the idea of supercompensation. And this is kind of an early model. It was based on the energy substrate availability and how that changed over time in response to training sessions. So the idea was that we would train, we'd see a drop in the availability of a particular substrate associated with that training session. Over the course of our recovery, we would start to see the levels of that particular substrate increase and return to normal, but during that period, performance was going to be reduced. At the point where the substrate returned to normal levels, we'd actually potentially see us overshoot slightly and end up with this kind of super compensatory response where we had heightened levels of energy substrates available to us, and as a result our performance capacity was increased. That's not necessarily a perfect analogy for all training models, but like we tried to kind of almost extrapolate it across to all of the different training models that were out there, including strength training, power training, etc. But the one issue with this particular model is that it only really measures one variable, and that is performance capacity. That's fixed with the two-factor theory of adaptation, where we basically say that each training bout, each training stimulus is going to lead to two outcomes. It's going to lead to a positive outcome, which is the increases in fitness that we see, but it's also going to lead to a negative outcome, which is the increases in fatigue that we experience. Our ability to perform, or our preparedness, is going to be calculated by basically saying what's the increase in fitness and what's the increase in fatigue. Let's subtract the fatigue from fitness in order to give our capacity to perform on any given day. Obviously, as you have multiple bouts, this chart looks slightly different. We start to see a gradual increase in fitness, we start to see a gradual increase in fatigue, but the fitness tends to increase to a greater extent than fatigue over time if we've programmed things correctly. The changes in fitness are normally smaller in magnitude in response to a session, but also slightly longer in duration. So what that means is that immediately after a session, because the level of fatigue is so high, we see a drop in performance. But as we start to recover from that fatigue, because the fitness response is still in play and is going to be extended for a longer period of time, there gets to a point where that fitness response exceeds the fatigue response to that session. And at that point, we start to see an increase in preparedness above normal levels. So it kind of reflects that supercompensation period or phase from the supercompensation theory. But we have a better understanding of the two things that potentially go into that change in performance capacity. So now we're going to talk about deciding the dose and understanding training load a little bit. So what gets measured gets managed. Training load is how we measure the magnitude of a training stimulus. We can calculate training load by basically doing volume multiplied by intensity over time, with volume inputs being things like sets, reps, work time, distance, and calories, as well as other things, but basically anything that is defining the amount of work being performed. And then intensity inputs being things like weight, speed, incline and resistance, percentage 1 rep max, percentage heart rate max. So anything that basically tells us how hard that work was. So on the one hand, we've got our volume input, which is how much work was done. And then on the other side, we've got intensity inputs, which is how hard that work was. And those two things multiplied together gives us an idea of what our training load actually has been over the course of a given session. But without understanding the role of time, we don't really get a full understanding of training load, right? So time is often overlooked by most people, but actually it's really important to understand not just the amount of load, but over what time period that load was we were exposed to that load. So are we looking at load on a set-by-set basis? Are we looking at load on a session-by-session basis? Are we looking at training days? Are we looking at training weeks, training blocks, or even training years, training like complete training cycles, macro cycles? Once we have an understanding of how much load's we've been exposed to over the course of each of these things, we can then compare between similar units, right? So I can compare what happened in mesocycle 3 versus mesocycle 4 in terms of the average daily load to give myself a decent understanding of how hard that block was and whether or not I'm progressing things over time. Similarly, I could do the same with a whole macro cycle. So I could say, how much load was I exposed to on average in year 1 versus year 2? If I'm exposing myself to more load in year 2, I'm going to see greater training outcomes again, and then I kind of want to continually see myself progress that over time. Another thing we kind of want to think about, so we know how to define our load, but what is the right amount of load for an individual athlete, okay? And this is about understanding the optimal training individual. So when it comes to establishing this, we're looking to first understand what the minimum effective dose is that the athlete can be exposed to that is going to promote some level of adaptation, and also what the maximum recoverable dose is which is the amount of work we can expose that athlete to beyond which they won't be able to recover between session bouts, and they'll actually start to see maladaptation as a response of their training program. Basically, any work that's carried out between these two metrics is going to be optimal for promoting adaptation without overwhelming the system. So what do these things mean in practice? Our role as a coach is to build a plan that progressively exposes our clients to specific stimuli that will guide them towards their desired goals. There are a couple of big things that we want to talk about. So first is progressive overload. And progressive overload is the principle that basically refers to the need to systematically progress the training dose in line with adaptation. And it's a combination of two prior principles from the sport anagram that was used for understanding training programming practice. And that is overload and progression. So overload is the idea that it's essential to create a stimulus that's large enough, or expose the body to a stimulus that's large enough to promote adaptation. Progression comes down to the idea that as we increase in our level of fitness, our tolerance to load increases, our sensitivity to load decreases, and as a result we need larger training stimuluses in order to promote further adaptation. So combining those two things together explains why we need to continually try to gradually progress load to meet the new threshold for adaptation as we move through a training program. It's important to note that obviously we can see regression as well. So if we've not exposed ourselves to a particular stimulus for an extended period of time, our tolerance to that stimulus is going to decrease, our sensitivity to that stimulus is going to increase as well. So we need smaller doses to promote adaptation. So if you are taking a bit of a break from a particular training modality, when you reintroduce that modality, you'll find that you don't need to do as much work in order to get the same level of adaptation. A point of interest here is the idea of proactive versus reactive approaches to designing a program. So from a proactive standpoint, I might plan in all of the progressions that I want to make over the course of a given plan. So what my progressions are going to be on a week-by-week basis. And that's a really useful approach if you're taking someone who is an athlete who has a really specific deadline, has a really important sort of tournament on a given day, or you only have like a 3-month block in which to create the maximum amount of fitness development. And you kind of want to try and make sure that you are exposing them to the right stimuli at the right time to get them to perform at their peak on that day. It becomes less important and less relevant when you're working with people who are general population or people who have less strict deadlines. And in those scenarios, you might want to take more of a reactive approach, whereby you kind of allow them to self-regulate their training load. So you suggest maybe that they work somewhere between a 7 and an 8 in terms of their RPE. They will come in whatever state they're in on a given day, and their ability to push will be regulated by how fatigued they are, how much their fitness has improved, and over time you should still see that because their performance capacity is increasing as they're getting fitter, their ability to push increases, and what is their RPE 8 is still a greater degree of load than what was their RPE 8 at an earlier stage. It's really important to not let yourself get lazy if this is the approach you're taking, because it can be easy to go, okay, well, people are self-regulating, I'm going to program them, and I'm just going to move through the training cycle without really taking any note of any of their metrics. But as a result, you might miss out on a drop-off in performance capacity. And if that drop-off in performance capacity is happening for a sustained period, it might be a suggestion that either you're not loading them hard enough or you're overloading them. And you need to be aware of that in order to make the right changes to a plan. Another key principle for us to look at is the idea of specificity. And this is the idea that every stimulus is specific in nature in terms of the adaptations that it's going to promote. I can't utilize a stimulus that's designed to promote hypertrophy and think that that's going to lead to adaptations and cardiovascular capacity. There might be some crossover, but realistically, each specific stimulus is specific in outcome, so we just need to be aware of that. That said, we need to simultaneously take a global and specific view of load in general. So when I'm creating a training plan, I'm not just thinking, okay, how do I overload each specific stimulus? I'm also looking at how much total load I'm exposing the human body to make sure that the overall load across all the stimuli isn't creating a level of stress that my body can't adapt to. So the goal is to overload enough of the specific stimuli to move me forward in the right direction without necessarily overloading my entire body and stopping myself from being able to react to any of those stimuli. This becomes particularly important when we start looking at the difference between binary and concurrent approaches to training. So if I'm looking at a standard linear model of training where I take someone from block 1, which is focused on maximum strength development, to block 2, which is focused on maximum power development, because I'm only really focusing on one stimulus, the chances are that I'm not going to overload the global system, so I can focus more on just making sure that I'm getting enough load in each area to promote the adaptation that I want to see within each block. But if I take a more concurrent approach where I'm training lots of different modalities of fitness at the same time, there's a bigger risk that the sum of all of those different stimuli is going to become too stressful for the body to handle. And as a result, it might prevent adaptation. So I might need to consider moving more towards some form of conjugate approach where I'm only targeting certain levels of fitness, certain components of fitness in a way that is adaptive or stimulating while maintaining other areas of fitness. Or I might want to really focus on trying to hit the minimum effective dose in each of those areas in order to minimize the total load that I'm being exposed to while still moving forwards across all areas of fitness. Another thing to consider is the idea of how you time your stimuli. So you want to make sure that you're providing a stimulus frequently enough that you're continuing to see positive adaptations and you're capitalizing on the previous adaptations made, while still giving yourself enough recovery time between bouts that you're allowing those positive adaptations to occur. So if I train too frequently, the chances are that I'm not going to give myself enough time to recover, and I'm just going to start gradually moving towards maladaptation and a drop off in performance and potentially overtraining. But if I don't train often enough, then I might never see any kind of positive adaptation long term, because by the time I'm training again, I'm just back to baseline. The point of interest here is the idea of shock blocks. So shock blocks are periods of training where you might potentially deliberately overload a stimulus to a greater extent than you would normally, creating a bigger deficit and a bigger drop in performance to lead to a larger kind of super compensation phase. And this can be useful for elite level athletes who you're struggling to create enough of a stimulus to overload them and meet that threshold for adaptation, but it might also be useful during periods of tapering where you're looking for a delayed improvement in fitness and a larger improvement in fitness while still allowing your athlete to taper and appear in a competition as fresh as possible to compete. In that scenario, it's really hard to predict what's going to happen, and it's really, really challenging to make sure that you're peaking an individual at the right time, but it's definitely worth looking into how you can use shock blocks within that phase of training and potentially even how that links into block periodization, which is two kind of stacked shock blocks followed by a taper window to get your athlete to compete on a specific day with the right level of performance capacity. So what happens if we get this wrong? So if we train too frequently, we might lead to maladaptation as a result of overtraining. If we think back to the models of adaptation that we went through at the start, there's a chance that basically we're not giving ourselves enough time to experience that super compensation phase, and therefore we're not going to see an increase in performance capacity. But also there's a risk that that secondary stimulus is going to lead to a steeper decline in performance capacity and a lower drop in performance capacity, so we're going to be even further from baseline, and as a result longer recovery times. And if that continues for too long, if it's not necessarily planned in any particular way, we might reach a point where we start to experience overtraining syndrome. So we start getting athletes who are irritable, getting people who are moody, getting people who are struggling with motivation, and also people who are more at risk of injury. So definitely something to bear in mind. But also, as I said before, this can be done deliberately if you're doing it as part of a shock block, but it's just really important to monitor what's happening in terms of athlete fatigue and athlete mood, etc. Another very quick thing that we're going to cover is just the interplay between different training stimuli. So different approaches are going to lead to different training stimuluses being exposed to the body at the same time. Those stimuli can interact in a multitude of ways. Sometimes they won't react at all. Other times they'll interact in a way that is summative, so they'll combine to create a bigger training dose. So in the case of, say, mechanical tension, when it comes to building muscle, that can be augmented by processes associated with metabolic stress or with muscle damage. So you might not need to have as big of a mechanical tension stimulus if those other two things are at play, because they'll augment the stimulus and therefore reach the threshold for adaptation. Something to consider. The other type of interaction that you could see is this idea of there being an interfering interaction where one stimulus might interact negatively with another, inhibiting the outcomes of that secondary stimulus. So this kind of links into the interference effects and the idea that maybe cardio might kill our gains. Something that recently we've started to think is less and less important and less relevant, particularly with kind of lower level athletes. But as you move up through like that athlete development pathway, if you're working with elite level athletes, particularly athletes who are elite in one area over another, it becomes more important to consider and bear that in mind in terms of how you time your training sessions, which moves us on nicely to how we should structure our training week. So when creating a training plan, you want to structure your sessions in a way that capitalizes on the interactions between different training sessions and the stimuli that are associated with those sessions. Two things that we kind of really want to consider is how fatigue incurred across sessions impacts subsequent sessions, right? So if I do a cardiovascular session on a Monday where I go out and I run 25 kilometers or heaven forbid 50, because I am a very heavy human, the impact of that in terms of the fatigue that's going to be experienced in my muscles is going to really prevent me from pushing as hard in a subsequent strength session, speed session, power session. Because the stimulus that I need to produce in order to improve speed, power, or strength requires a certain level of intensity, if I fatigue myself so much that I can't then work at that intensity, I'm not going to overload the necessary systems that are going to lead to me enhancing those three big biomotor abilities. So one of the recommendations is typically that we do any kind of higher intensity work prior to lower intensity work, because it doesn't necessarily impact in the same way. So you want to kind of work from high speed to low speed, high force to low force. And the reason it doesn't necessarily matter as much if we start moving towards the endurance end of the spectrum is if I go out and I do a heavy squat session on the Monday and then I try to go for a run, the fatigue induced by that heavy squat session is going to leave me feeling a little bit tired, a little bit achy, but actually it's going to challenge my body in a similar sort of way. It's going to reduce the degree to which I have to shift from baseline in order to meet an adaptive threshold for endurance capacity, because I'm already carrying fatigue, and the primary thing that I'm trying to do within an endurance session is increase levels of fatigue to the point that they promote adaptive responses that help me cope better with fatigue. So you can stack a strength session before an endurance session, but you don't want to do it the opposite way around necessarily. The other thing that we want to consider is the interactions between different stimuli that we just covered. We want to be aware of how those interactions will impact the magnitude of a dose. Okay, so if I do 2 sessions back to back, but those 2 sessions are summative, I might find that I can get away with doing a smaller dose in each session, but still, by combining those 2 sessions in 2 subsequent days, meet a threshold for adaptation. The opposite is true when it comes to consecutive days of interfering stimuli. So if I'm doing a running workout the day before I do a strength workout again, the AMPK pathway associated with that running workout might interfere with the mTOR pathway associated with that strength workout. And as a result, I might see a diminishing return, or I might struggle more to reach the threshold of adaptation in that subsequent session. Those are the things that you want to kind of consider, particularly if you're working with hybrid athletes or you're taking a more concurrent approach to your training. I hope that was useful. If you do have any questions, feel free to chuck them into the comments. I'm looking for a group of coaches at the moment who want to try and further themselves, build their understanding of fitness, build their understanding of the science that underpins that, but also work on their businesses, work with a group that are all trying to move forward at the same sort of time. If you're interested in joining that group, feel free to drop me a message. Yeah, I'm kind of keen to start moving forward with this sort of stuff because I feel like it's an area that I have quite a lot of value to add in. And yeah, I'm kind of looking to add that value because I find it interesting. I think the world benefits a lot from having better coaches out there. So yeah, drop me a message and hopefully you can be part of the team. Take care.